If a coronal mass ejection or a disaster of an equivalent magnitude took down the power grid tomorrow, how would the masses of unprepared and prepared people alike confront this new reality that they're faced with? No electricity, no heat, no law enforcement, no medicine, limited transportation, and grocery stores that are no longer replenished. What sort of collective behavior and mass hysteria might emerge under these circumstances? That's going to be the topic of today's video, so stay tuned. In prepping, we have many abbreviations and acronyms like SHTF, BOB for Bug Out Bag. There's also a phrase called the Golden Horde, which refers to the millions of people who are fleeing a disaster zone or fleeing the cities in search of resources once those cities have been exhausted. Now, it is presumed, and perhaps somewhat arrogantly by some preppers, that these people are unprepared to deal with any sort of disaster. They are the farthest thing from being self-reliant. They are completely dependent on the grid for their survival. Most of them don't even realize that fact because that's all they've ever known, just like all a fish has ever known its whole life is water until it's removed from that water. So because cities cannot sustain the populations they have without the help of technology, without the grid shipping in supplies, the idea is that these people are going to have to go somewhere, that there's going to be a massive exodus from the cities, but not before these cities have been ransacked for supplies. Now, it should be noted that these people, although characterized as marauders, the metaphor of the zombie comes to mind, but it should be known that these are not necessarily bad people. They're just people who are unprepared and who are trying to survive the situation. And they're doing whatever they have to do in most cases, although as we've seen throughout history, there's a lot of cases of looting which people are looting for things which they don't necessarily need, but things that they want. I would say a justifiable mob are a group of people like the people in Venezuela who are looting in order to feed themselves. To me, even though you could argue that it's morally wrong for them to do so, you could also provide a lot of reasons why it's okay for them to do that in order to survive, as opposed to someone who's just stealing TV sets and Apple iPads that they won't be able to use because the grid is not going to be coming back for a long, long time. This will, however, provide the opportunity for the forward-thinking people to take advantage of the actual useful resources that they're going to need in order to survive while people are preoccupied with fulfilling all of their wants and desires. And it should also be known that just because you're a prepper doesn't make you immune to having to evacuate a certain region with all of your supplies, hence the importance of caching different supplies, which will be discussed in a future video. Now, before we start to speculate on group behavior in these theoretical dire conditions, people should be first reminded of the fact that many different social psychological researchers have shown us throughout the years that even the most upstanding citizens in the best of times can be coaxed into doing very unethical things. The Stanley Milgram experiments showed us that the majority of people, so long as they didn't have to take the blame for their actions, would exact violence remotely via electric shock to an anonymous person. Now, I want you to multiply that tendency by a couple factors. One, that as resources start to quickly dwindle after the first few weeks after a major disaster, like the example I gave earlier of the coronal mass ejection that completely destroyed the entire power grid, within a few weeks, you're going to have deprivation. You're going to have people which are malnourished and not thinking clearly. You're going to have people who are wanting a scapegoat for what has happened to them. You're going to have a lot of disgruntled people who have to adapt to a new, downgraded standard of living. You're going to have the absence of rule of law, so the absence of immediate, at least, consequences for their actions. And you may already start to have charismatic leaders emerge who, whether intentionally or not, are directing the actions of these people to do things which they otherwise likely would not do in the best of times. What this essentially means is that 99% of people out there, people you know, people you work with, your neighbors, even your own family members, the capability lies within them to either be persuaded or persuade themselves into committing immoral acts, for a lack of a better word, against you and the people you love. The primitive behavior that characterizes a rioting group of people or a mob, under the right circumstances, very few of us are immune to herd behavior. So the talking points in this video are not only to act as a guideline for yourself and how to prepare for these mass mobs, and also what warning signs to look for in yourself, as you, just like anybody else, can just as easily be hypnotized and succumb to the mob mentality. For the better part of human evolution, people have not lived in the large groupings that we do now in these very large cities. Crowd psychology is a relatively new field. Understanding how human beings behave in such large groups is something which has fascinated social psychological researchers for many centuries, and there is still a lot left that we don't know. But we can appreciate that in a grid down scenario, the herd mentality is going to manifest in a lot of different areas at different stages of the collapse. So for instance, in the early stages of a collapse scenario, this sort of collective behavior or group mind is going to emerge in the swarms of people who are rioting and looting. The idea of the group mind is that the group takes on a mind of its own, that the people within that mob or riot become what we call de-individuated, meaning that they lose their sense of individuality. All of their own personal morals, ethics, beliefs get temporarily suspended when they become a part of this mass hypnotic state that they share with everybody else who's doing the same thing that they're doing, which is mobbing and rioting and looting and all the rest. Just like a herd of sheep or a swarm of birds or any insect or a creature for that matter that partakes in this swarming behavior, a certain level of autonomy is conceded by the individual to the greater group at large, and the group then takes on an organic life of its own. This means that most of the things that make you you, and most of the conscience that you hold so dear in the real world, and the virtue that you hold so dear, is temporarily suspended, and you cease to live through that culturally imposed filter, and thus you do things that you wouldn't normally do. But if you've ever been in a mosh pit in your life at a really good rock concert, you probably can appreciate how quickly that primal collectivism and fanaticism can overtake your body and direct your actions. But rioting and looting is not the only way that it's going to manifest in a post-collapse environment. Once the initial disorganized swarm herd behavior shock and awe phase of SHTF occurs, it's going to break off into gangs, lynch mobs. People are probably going to erect kangaroo courts. In the absence of without rule of law, people are going to make laws which are probably unconstitutional and non-democratic. People are going to want a scapegoat for what has happened to them. No matter what the disaster, people are going to want to blame somebody. Even if it's a natural disaster, the tendency will be for people to say, well, why wasn't the forewarning system good enough? Or why wasn't the government prepared enough? People want to allocate blame, and when there's no law in place to protect those who can't protect themselves from these kangaroo court, pitchfork-bearing lynch mobs, there's going to be people who are singled out and blamed for the events that have transpired. It's not far-fetched to believe that certain extremist cults and religious groups might emerge that are going to take on a ritual of a lottery of sorts in which people are sacrificed for the greater good. This is a distinct possibility in the later phases of a post-collapse world. So you have the looting phase, the rioting phase, you have the lynch mob phase, you have the kangaroo court phase, and you have the cult phase of collapse. Now all of these conglomerations of people have some traits that are typical of them. Most of them are operating on the emotional level, a more primitive level. They're not operating on a cerebral level, which involves a lot of rationality, logic, foresight. These people are going to be easily triggered by commands issued from a person they perceive to be in charge, or just other members of the crowd who themselves are impulsively committing certain behaviors. There's going to be a diffusion of responsibility in that the larger the group of people, the larger the crowd, the more anonymous a person can become, and thus the more capable they are of committing very heinous and violent activities against other people. People in this mob mentality are going to be very suggestible. They're going to be very gullible. And in fact, they're going to be at the whim of the swarm. So because they lack individuality, because you lack autonomy in this group mob stampede mindset, you're almost going to be seeking direction. These things are all going to be magnified by things like how desperate is the situation? How bad has it got? Is it so bad that people haven't eaten in a few days? Because if you have an angry, starving mob of people, that makes things a lot more problematic, and starving mobs of people will pretty much do whatever they have to do to survive because they have absolutely no choice whatsoever. So those same inhibitions that they might possess normally are going to go by the wayside when the fear of their own mortality kicks in. This is also going to be magnified by whatever leadership spell they might be under. Different types of symbols, kind of like patriotism, but on a smaller scale, could be used to potentially direct these people into committing atrocities against others and partaking in largely antisocial behavior. The simple fact that you're less likely to get caught for doing bad things is likely to have people devolve into the worst versions of themselves. We see this in Venezuela right now, where there's an unfortunate situation where a combination of sanctions, a change in government, and pre-existing ineffective government policies have created a situation in which people are starving. There's people who are slaughtering cattle that doesn't belong to them in the countryside, people branching out from the cities to try to find this food in the rural areas, raiding fishing boats, looting grocery stores. I think as of January 28th, already 113 mass looting incidents were recorded in Venezuela. People are eating horses in order to subsist. So the situation is very bad, and that's not even a situation of the scope that what we're talking about here. If we're talking about a collapse of the power grid, where it's been predicted that if the power grid, not necessarily all your small-scale electronics even, or even the vehicles, but just the grid as a whole, the 2,300 plus transformers that direct the usable electricity in North America would be crippled and potentially cause a massive die-off in the population. Some people have predicted it would be as high as 90% after the first year, because you need to think that if you don't have electricity, you don't have the ability to run farm equipment, because you don't have the oil to run that farm equipment. You don't have the vehicles that can transport that food to market, that can process that food. You don't have the medicine, the life support systems that are going to be keeping people alive. In fact, a lot of your resources are probably going to be devoted to ensuring that many of the nuclear power plants can keep running and not go into meltdown. In addition to that, you're going to want to maintain your borders, because surely if there ever was a time to invade a country, it's after they fell victim to a disaster like this. So the critical infrastructure is going to be totally crippled, and whatever assets remain are probably going to go to the military and the government to try to get a handle on things once again, which is going to probably be quite impossible for the majority of the continent. So how do you defend yourself then against mobs and groups of people? Well, number one is to not be caught up in a mob in the first place. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's not too hard to find yourself in a set of circumstances in which you may become a part of a flash mob, or perhaps you do live in an urban environment and the mob comes through your neighborhood. Or heaven forbid something happen and you are forced to bug out, you lose all your preps and you become one of the marauders. You become one of these people in one of these lynch mobs that I'm talking about. And you become one of these people who have to loot to survive. And a lot of people are going to quickly judge those who are looting in order to survive. But the fact is, you don't know what put that person in that circumstance. You know, they may have well been a prepper who just happened to lose it all at the last minute. Yes, it may just be that they're unprepared and SOL as far as most preppers are concerned. But what I'm trying to say here is that all of us are susceptible to groupthink, to this mass hysteria that I'm talking about. And that reminds me that there is one other area in which this collective group mind behavior manifests, and it is in the hysteria that might precede an event. It may happen during an event when, you know, like let's say you got word that the bombs were going to start dropping. You would have within the next 15 minutes a good chance of probably being killed on your commute to try to get home to the people you love, because people will be driving so frantically and erratically and not thinking clearly that there would be a lot of accidents. It would be gridlock. It would be SHTF before it was even SHTF, simply because of the mass hysteria. Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, and people thought that the world was coming to an end and the world was being invaded by aliens when he did that news broadcast. The power of hype and hysteria is almost powerful enough to actually create the collapse itself. There's many scenarios where we can imagine that happening and being the case. Look at the stock market. If people anticipate that it's going to be a bear market and people start selling and selling off, that in itself, that stampede, the running with the bulls mentality, can cause the economy to essentially collapse in some ways. Not entirely, but it can cause a massive downturn in the stock market. It's important that we have some tactics in order to defend ourselves from these situations. And probably the number one advantage you have as an outsider looking inwards on a group that's caught in the grips of this group thinking mentality is that you are using the full capacity of your brain, at least to the fullest potential that you are capable of, in that you are thinking as opposed to acting on the whim of your emotions. And that's something to keep in mind. If you are being approached by an angry mob, or if there's looting coming through your area, it's important to understand that yes, as a herd, people are a force to be reckoned with, but the difference between intelligence, at least in that moment, between you and them, is literally like the intellectual difference between one of the most primitive of primate species and human beings. There's a huge difference in terms of the actual cognitive functioning of somebody who's standing outside an angry mob than people who are actually within it, because the people who are within that angry, riotous mob are 9 times out of 10 acting on the whim of their emotions and not their thoughts. Now, knowing that allows you to anticipate and predict what their behavior is going to be. And in knowing this, that may allow you to strategically position yourself in a place which is more advantageous to better defend yourself. Now, one of the most effective crowd control deterrents has to be the principle of subterfuge or deception, making your enemy think something is the case when it's not the case. And this is much easier to do with large groups when you think about it, because they're not thinking as clearly. So they're not going to take the time to assess whether or not the signs that you're posting are actually real, or if they're just put there to deceive them. So take in the instance of a pandemic. Simply putting a biohazard symbol somewhere in the place where you dwell, or in a place where you don't want people to go, could make people think twice about entering that place. Now, I know that's counterintuitive, because we're talking about how an angry mob might not be thinking and might just put themselves in precarious situations, and they may well do that. But at the same time, I think that the basic senses are probably going to still be there, and if people knew, if it was that important to their survival that they didn't come into contact with an infectious contagion, then I'm pretty sure that at least momentarily that would override the contagion of their own collective behavior. Using signs like "looters will be sniped." I know it sounds cold, and I'm not saying that a person actually has to act on it, but a sign like that can really put the fear in people, because it's more specific than "looters will be shot." It's saying "looters will be sniped." So that makes people think, well, that's a lot longer range than shot. Now, I need to post as a disclaimer that I'm not encouraging any sort of illegal activity, nor am I commenting on the morality of this, but I will say this: if those signs prevent people from coming your way and prevent you from ever having to take that sort of lethal action or less than lethal action against them, then you just saved their life and probably yours as well. Using decoys, using distractions, a lot of these tactics, I should say, are things which I've been doing research on riot control, and a lot of these tactics are used by police, who are usually outnumbered and don't want to resort to lethal force. These are their strategies they employ for crowd control. So creating some sort of distraction in the environment, perhaps having a diversion which you're able to control via remote that can take people's attention away from where you don't want that attention to be on. This could mean things like setting up trip lines, setting up false caches, or caches of food which are made to look as though that is all of the provisions that you have, even though it's just the tip of the iceberg, but it appears as though that's what you value the most, which may discourage people from trying to look further and get into your real stash. Now, one of the first things that they teach riot police, and you'll probably notice this in a lot of protests that you go to, and I'm not saying that a lot of these, the way that sometimes these protests are broken up is legitimate. I'm just saying that this is how the local police are seeing it. So what they do first is they go in and they observe. They're trying to figure out who the leaders are so they can essentially take them out if cooperation is no longer a factor. And it's seldom nowadays that police even try to cooperate and negotiate. Usually it's moving right into corporal force. So in addition to looking at the leadership, they're assessing the mood, the size of the crowd, what their energy is like, what their intentions are, if that can be deciphered, what their capabilities are, if they were to fully mob out. When looking at perimeter or home defense, always consider that it's mostly the path of least resistance that people naturally gravitate towards. And this is something which is certainly going to be even truer in the case of a swarm or a mob of people. You can think of herd behavior as being like water. If you pour water into the ground and it starts, creating a little stream or river through all the cracks in the dirt and whatnot, what you're going to find is it's going to move towards the path of least resistance. People are going to bypass a hard target and go to one which is softer and less likely to get them injured. This is the case of whether or not you're using a biohazard sign to deter people, or your house looks like it's built like Fort Knox. If you're aware of what the path of least resistance is going to be, this is going to provide you with a significant tactical advantage. You can even set up decoy paths into your territory to funnel people into a certain region that will give you a tactical advantage in terms of defending your territory. If all of these things fail and you're somehow able to gray man immerse yourself in the crowd, depending on which type of situation, it may not be as easy in a lynch mob or kangaroo court situation where it may well be a smaller, more slightly organized group that's steered by a charismatic leader. But if you find yourself in the midst of looting and rioting and you're in your home, the only method of survival may well be to try to blend in with those looters and those rioters. Kind of like if you can't beat them, join them. And of course, only join them until you're able to get out of that scene. Without rule of law, the large concentrations of people in the modern urban megalopolises are going to begin to act up not too long after an incident like this. And it's not going to take much to spark that fire. For instance, say if the power ever went out in New York City. You know, there might be some backup generators here and there, and people may, for the first few days, be somewhat cooperative. But all it takes is for that one guy to throw a brick through a window, and that's when everybody starts throwing bricks through windows. I'm speaking metaphorically, of course. As an individual, if you can keep your calm in these situations, you're going to be like Bobby Fischer, and they're going to be a mindless foot soldier. So use that to your advantage. Some of these groups are going to have xenophobic undertones. It's just a fact of life that certain marginalized groups may be even further marginalized in a crap hits the fan situation, which is all the more reason for those groups to be very well prepared for what potentially could be coming down the pike. So I hope you found this video thought-provoking today. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, show your support for this channel. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.